terrific turnout. I mean, it's just a joy. I arrived on the island about 4 hours ago, so I could be here for this meeting. And so I welcome you all to our 33rd season of the Islesboro Forum Speaker Series. I will be the moderator for the evening. My name is Gail Jackson. And we have a speaker who obviously has touched a responsive chord, a very responsive chord. The way in which we have arranged for him to come deserves a quick, short story as well. Bruce Claflin is going to introduce Dr. Shah. Bruce has been pursuing Dr. Shah for the last 3 years, I think. And yay! You'll see Bruce in a moment. He'll give you a more detailed background on Dr. Shah before he begins to speak. Let me just say a couple of things that are more or less routine. One is that we are a nonprofit organization, and we welcome your contributions to help cover our expenses, which include technical production and some publicity and to some extent the travel of our speakers, Quicksilver and such. So think about that over the summer, and we'll be grateful for any contribution that you feel comfortable making. Several people have said to me, Gail, this looks like a fantastic lineup of speakers. I'm delighted to hear those remarks, and if so, it's largely because of our excellent committee and some of you in the audience who have also been responsible for finding speakers this summer. I'm going to mention my committee members very quickly. They deserve recognition and vote of gratitude from all of you. So we have Leslie Glotzel, Bruce Claflin, whom I mentioned earlier, Helen Elkins, Peter Rothschild, and Nina Herrick. And I think I've covered all of them. So it's a wonderful group, and their task is lightened a little bit by the fact that we have such a talented island community with so many wonderful connections that we've been able to draw on over the years. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Bruce Claflin to introduce our speaker. He'll talk for however long he wants to, and then take your questions and answers. So Bruce, would you take over?
Thank you. Well, good evening. I'm a little intimidated because even a well-accomplished person would feel like a slacker after you hear the resume that I'm about to give you. He has a BS in both psychology and economics. He then achieved his MD and his JD. So he's an economist, a medical doctor, a lawyer, and a psychologist. Sounds like the opening to a bar joke. One of his earliest jobs was at the Cambodian Ministry of Health, and he served in a financial and planning role, but then he was an epidemiologist, and he was dealing with dengue fever, SARS, and avian influenza. Then, for a change of pace, he became a lawyer with Sidley Austin in Chicago, and he was working on healthcare regulation and enforcement. Then went to the Illinois Department of Public Health, and what happened? They had an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease. From there to Maine, where he became our state CDC director, where of course he led the response to the COVID outbreak. So think about this. Dr. Shah's dealt with dengue fever, SARS, avian flu, Legionnaire's disease, and COVID. So I hope you won't mind if I would just put this mask on for a minute here. I'm feeling a little exposed around him. From his great work, though, that he did at the Maine CDC, he was appointed the deputy director in the Atlanta CDC, and then he was the acting director of the CDC before resigning to return to Maine. And his most recent appointment is a visiting professor at Colby College. He'll be teaching and creating a full undergraduate public health program. But for most of us, we know Dr. Shah as the clear, concise, rational voice that on his many press conferences held during COVID. In fact, he was so admired that a group of fans created a Facebook page called Fans of Dr. Shah. which grew to 38,000 members. And as I learned today, there's a candy bar called the Shah Bar, and coffee cups, which still may be for sale for some fundraiser somewhere. But those press conferences were hugely reassuring, and the efforts that he made Maine one of the great leaders in the state in terms of its combating of COVID. And so I'd like to welcome up here, you might remember, take a second here. He also had a Diet Coke with him every time he did a press conference. One time he choked on it. He had to assure the audience it was really the Coke. But Dr. Shah, come on down.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. Please, please keep going. Please, do not stop. What a privilege and an honor. Thank you all so much. I'm just so delighted to see a packed room on a summer Sunday on your beautiful island. And so I'm just beyond gratified that so many of you would choose to spend a little bit of time in the midst of your summer talking about what is decidedly an optimistic topic, which is the next pandemic. I want to do a couple of things at the very, very beginning. The first is I'd like to get a group picture. And so if we could all just go outside we'll do a giant group selfie, which I'm going to endeavor to do. Oh, that actually works pretty well. Okay, great. All right, please smile. Okay, good, good. Now I've got a memento to carry us through. First of all, this has been my first trip to Islesboro, and it couldn't have been under better circumstances. Not just the opportunity to chat with everybody tonight about a topic that's very near and dear to me, our preparedness for the next pandemic, but also to see firsthand the wonderful community that is Islesboro. I want to take a second to thank Bruce and Carrie. They have shown me around the island all day today. Its charms, its histories, its bookstores, its cafes, and it's been just a lovely, lovely day. So thank you both for not only just the invitation to join, but for sharing with me your home and your island. Just to allude to the story about how I got here, Bruce reached out to me about a year and a half ago. And my email, my government email at the CDC, it's not the easiest to find. And so he went through the normal communications channels and got a message to me and had invited me to speak last summer, but things were crazy and I couldn't commit to being here last summer. But I did commit to joining you all this summer, and hence here we are. And so thanks, Bruce, for reaching out. Thanks for persevering and not saying, I'm writing that guy off. Thank you for keeping it up, because I'm truly, truly honored to be here. Among the things that Bruce and Carrie shared with me today was the opportunity to meet with and see firsthand your new Island Health Center. And it is truly spectacular. Really, really spectacular. And I want to comment not only on the technical capacity. Owen and Dory, who might be here this evening. I think Owen in the back there, and not only technically first class, but what was the most impressive to me was the way in which the island came together to say, we're going to prioritize health and healthcare, and we're going to put our money where our mouth is and make that happen. Linda was able to join us as well, who talked about the efforts that she made on the fundraising front, where literally everyone on the island came together. And I wanted to take a moment to commend all of you for doing so and making the health of your community a top priority. That health center is proof positive of that, and I wanted to just share how blown away I was by it. So really, hats off to you all. The other reason, though, that health center is important is a theme that I'm going to talk about, which is the divide between safety and vulnerability. And we're going to talk about that in the context of pandemics. You all know far better than anybody, having lived it firsthand, this twin side of how, even during the midst of a pandemic, the very factors that make you safe are also the very factors that make you vulnerable. It was years into the pandemic before there were cases recorded here. But at the same time, this fear of what might happen were something to rip through the island and the impact it might have on critical infrastructure, et cetera. Those are two sides of the same coin. We live by that safety, but they also create vulnerabilities. That divide plays out at a national, if not international scale. The very parts of the world that we worry about when it comes to the next pandemic emerging, on one hand, they're quite safe because of their isolation, sub-Saharan Africa, the mountains of Asia, et cetera. But at the same time, because of how isolated they are, their ability to contain something is that much lower. And were something to materialize, it would tear through those very isolated communities and invariably spread. And so we have a microcosm of that very dynamic just here on Islesboro, and it's something we'll talk about a little bit more. What I'd like to do this evening is spend a little bit of time, maybe about 12 to 15 minutes, setting the table on this central question for the evening. Are we prepared for the next pandemic? But then reserve the balance of time to talk about any and everything that I've raised. And here's sort of where I'd like to go. Folks who have worked with me know that I love nothing more than questions that are disagreeable. I have an old saying when I have meetings, which is, if both of us agree on something, then one of us is not necessary for this meeting. And so I would love to hear your toughest questions, your criticisms, your pushback. This would be a great forum to do so in. So I welcome whatever question may be on your mind. However untoward or incendiary you may think it is, I assure you I am ready for it. So let's dive right in. And again, the central question for the evening is, are we prepared for the next pandemic? And the answer is no. So thank you all very much. We can probably wrap up and go straight to questions, although I suspect you're going to want a little bit more of an explanation as to why I'm of that conclusion. Well, my thesis for the evening is as follows, and my way of thinking about pandemics is as follows. Pandemics start off small. They're often unnoticed, and then they grow larger from negligence, systematic negligence. And in growing larger, they lay bare the weaknesses of our systems, healthcare and otherwise. And we don't fix those weaknesses. Instead, we let them rot. And as a result of that, we set the groundwork for the next pandemic to happen, and in many respects, to come back with even more ferocity. And indeed, what we often do in a time of crisis is to look for easy answers to tough questions, which then sets us up to have to grapple with far more profound threats later on. And so that's going to be the thesis that I return to over and over again. One note there is I'm going to be talking about pandemics this evening, but I think you'll see very, very quickly that truly anything we talk about this evening could be applied not just to biological disasters, but environmental and other disasters as well. And so as we're going through the conversation this evening, I urge you to think not just about what we're talking about in the setting of the next pandemic, but in the setting of the next flood, or in the next mass shooting in Western Maine, or in the setting of whatever crisis or catastrophe may be coming our way. Because it's only a matter of time before Maine suffers the next such disaster, and the same thesis that I laid out, that these things start small, grow large from negligence, expose weaknesses in the system, and lead to a search for easy answers to tough questions that we decline to answer, that applies with equal force to a lot of other disasters and crises that are coming our way. But tonight, we're going to focus largely on these biological threats, the pandemic threats. And so I asserted a moment ago that we are truly not prepared for the next pandemic. And so what I'd like to spend the balance of my talk on is enumerating some of the reasons why we are not where we need to be from a preparedness perspective. To talk about some of the threats that we're facing that I don't believe we have adequately addressed that do in fact leave us more vulnerable. The first category of those threats are what I like to think of broadly as ecological threats. And one rule of speaking is that you got to organize things with alliteration. So I have here for you the 4 C's that, in my view, are driving much of the ecological risk that will leave us vulnerable to the next pandemic. The first C is a world that is increasingly crowded. There's not much more to be said for that other than we've all seen it. We've seen it on TV. We've read about mega cities in Asia, horribly overcrowded cities in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, and even indeed in the United States. We're seeing higher and higher rates of density. Now, no matter what the benefits of those things may be from a commerce as well as other perspective, from a biological risk perspective, that high degree of crowding means that a disease once introduced can grow far more quickly, especially if, as with COVID, we see that it can be transmitted from person to person through respiratory droplets. This crowding is a definite factor that leaves us more and more exposed. The next C is convergence. And here's what I mean by convergence. By convergence, I'm referring to the line between animals and humans. The bulk of the threats that we see at the US CDC that we are keeping an eye on, threats, pathogens, bugs, viruses that could cause the next pandemic, they are ones that are likely to jump over from animal populations into humans. A good example of that are Ebola viruses and their cousins. Ebola viruses generally live in things like fruit bats. But every now and then, for various reasons, they can jump from the bat population into the human population. And that type of what's called spillover is happening more and more and more frequently because the millennia-old line between animals and humans is being dissolved. Humans are moving into animal territory. Animals are moving into human territory. And when you mix them together, you will invariably engender situations where viruses and bacteria that largely only existed in animal populations and were safely contained there will start spilling over into human populations. So that's the second C, convergence. The third C is an ever more connected world. This, too, doesn't require much explanation. We all now have a sense of how you can be in a plane in Hong Kong and be 12 time zones over in a matter of hours. That's a wonderful development for obvious reasons, but it also, from an infectious disease perspective, means that our vulnerability level is that much higher. And we're only becoming more connected, not less connected. And so this, too, will be another risk that leaves us more vulnerable for the next pandemic. And then, of course, the fourth C is the effect of climate change on all of this. You all here on the island have already seen what some of the impacts of climate change can be from a structural perspective. Those apply with equal force when it comes to an infectious disease perspective. There are numerous examples, but I'll offer you just 2. As the climate changes and warms in a lot of places, not just in Africa and Asia, but even here in the United States, mosquitoes, ticks, other types of bugs that previously did not or could not survive in northern climates, including Maine, are finding it now much more hospitable. I was talking when we were at the health center today with Dory and Owen, but you all have experienced it. Who feels like ticks are worse than ever right now? Yeah, same in Brunswick, where my family and I live. And that's not necessarily an accident. Winters are becoming warmer, which means that the overwarming likelihood of ticks is that much higher. And thus, we're experiencing more and more ferocious summers. Are ticks going to cause the next pandemic? Perhaps. There are already a number of diseases that they harbor that are increasing, but it need not be ticks. It can be mosquitoes, it can be bats, it can be a number of things that, again, were previously kept at bay, not in far-flung places in the world, like sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, but literally here in our own backyard. So those 4 C's, a crowded world, a converging world, a connected one that's grappling with climate change, those are the 4 principal drivers of why the risk of a pandemic is going up, not down. And frankly, I don't think we have adequately grappled with those risks as a world, as a globe, let alone as a country. I'm going to come back at the end to what we here in Maine can do to mitigate and buffer those risks. But those four ecological factors account for the lion's share of why I believe we remain vulnerable for the next pandemic. The bottom line there is I don't know when the next pandemic is going to happen, and I don't know which pathogen will cause it, but I do know that it will happen. Those four ecological factors are exceedingly difficult to control, as you can see by how technically complicated they are. So what I want to do now is enumerate some of the other factors, political, governmental, and otherwise, that I believe are far more within our sphere of control that can help us buy down the risk of the next pandemic far more effectively. The first risk is one of that, if you've been following the news, is very obvious, which is a set of financial risks. Now, the recent budget bill, et cetera, makes significant cutbacks in our public health infrastructure. And it would be easy to ascribe those to purely political reasons. I'm not going to do that this evening. Because the fact of the matter is, the way in which public health has been funded for decades, if not several decades, if not over 150 years, is that it's been funded in these boom and bust cycles. Something happens, we dedicate a lot of money for it, we basically get our head around the thing that happened, we don't solve the underlying funding issue, and thus we pull back on that funding, thinking or seeming to conclude that we've solved the issue. We figured COVID out. We don't need all that money anymore. And then we retract on that funding, thus setting us up for the next disaster, which is part of my thesis. We don't really grapple with the difficulty in funding things like public health preparedness in a sustained manner. And here's the thought experiment that I offer you this evening from a financial perspective. I tend to view, and indeed much of the work I did when I was at the US CDC, views this topic that we're talking about, the next pandemic, not so much as a medical one or even a human interaction one, but fundamentally about national security and public safety. Indeed, if the next pandemic happens and we don't have the diagnostics or the medicines or the vaccines ready to go, but foreign adversaries do in other parts of the world, we will obviously be on our back feet relative to China and other countries. And so this is truly a national security concern. But we don't fund pandemic preparedness the same way we do other national security assets. Imagine if we actually funded public health the way we funded the military, for example. Imagine if we funded pandemic preparedness the way that we fund public safety. We think of them as just as important, and when the crisis strikes, we all need those systems of public health to be up and running. But yet when the crisis recedes, we don't necessarily keep them funded in a way that we do keep them funded with other aspects of our public safety apparatus. And so when I talk about the financial aspects of pandemic preparedness, I'm expressly not making a political point. I'm asking the deeper political science question of, if we think this is about public safety, then why don't we fund it that way? If you don't believe that it's truly about public safety, ask yourself sort of a thought question that I think about a lot, which is, over 1 million people died in the United States during COVID, 1.1 million people, thousands of people here in Maine. And we don't talk about that. It's kind of fascinating. 1 million people. I mean, the state of Maine, in effect, died during COVID. And we don't really talk about it in that way. So it's clearly a public safety perspective, but we again don't fund it in that manner. And think about how we could or should. The next set of risks, moving beyond the financial, are tied to that, but a bit deeper, which is what I consider to be structural risks. Here's what I mean by that. The fundamental question in this world, in pandemics, and maybe even more broadly in disasters, the fundamental question is, how would we know? How would we know if something significant were happening in another part of the world, or even in our own country, that posed a significant public safety risk? Now, with the events of July 4th in Texas, where there are significant questions about how would people have known, how should they have known, This question is top of mind for everybody, but it's deeply connected to the work of being ready for the next pandemic. How would we know if the next superbug has emerged in sub-Saharan Africa? How would we know if a version of tuberculosis that's resistant to every antibiotic emerges in Hong Kong? And how much time would we have to prepare ourselves once we did know? That structure, that apparatus that lets us know when something is happening, that sets off flashing lights on the dashboard at the CDC, that system is similarly being taken apart and dismantled. Many of you have followed the dissolution of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, which was one part of that front line. But it's also been paralleled by a dismantling of a lot of the global staff at the US CDC. As I was departing the CDC, we had over 3,000 staff members deployed around the globe in 96 countries, some of the toughest parts of the world: Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Northern Laos. We had people there whose job it was to man the watchtower so that if the next virus started emerging, we knew about it. And by we, I don't just mean we here in this room. I mean the United States relative to other foreign adversaries. Because when it comes to a pandemic, every minute matters, every resource matters. And frankly, being ready for the next pandemic, it's not just an imperative of national security, it's an aspect of global competition. We need to not just be ready, but to be candid, we need to be more ready than other governments are. And right now, the dismantling of agencies like USAID and CDC leaves us more vulnerable because of this central question: how would we know? And without those folks on the watchtower, the answer increasingly is that we won't know. But I'll give you two guesses about who will. What countries have not been taking their staff away? Indeed, as I was leaving, what countries were moving more staff in to Rwanda and Laos and the places where the next pandemic is going to emerge? We're pulling back at a time when our adversaries are getting an even stronger foothold. And if they detect the next virus, they're not going to share it with us. The next category of threats are what I broadly refer to as psychological risks. And here's what I mean by that. You know, we're here talking about the next pandemic, and I'm, at some measure, taking pains not to talk about the last pandemic, because I want to look forward, not backwards. But there's another reason I'm doing that, which is after major traumatic events like COVID, like a climate disaster, like a shooting, sociologists and psychologists have documented how people just don't want to talk about it. If you've tried to talk about COVID with your family, as I have, but have gotten no, let's just talk about the game this weekend, you're not alone. Historians going all the way back to the 1918 pandemic have written about and documented how there was generally a collective amnesia after that pandemic. No one wanted to talk about it for years. Indeed, after the 1918 pandemic, there was a massive upspring in public works projects, hospitals that were built, health centers that were constructed, but not until 1925 or so. Everyone just took 4 or 5 years off and didn't focus on what they had lived through. And I understand that. I am not suggesting we snap out of that collective amnesia. There is a lot to be said for psychologically taking our mind off of it. I am not disputing that. But it is a risk because, again, the threat of the next pandemic is forthcoming. And if it were to happen in this period of amnesia, galvanizing the public to action, which is already a challenge, becomes tenfold harder. And we saw a little bit of this in 2022 with a smaller outbreak of Mpox, or formerly called monkeypox. Now, it ended up, thankfully, thanks to fast public health action, not turning into the next pandemic. But it was very difficult to galvanize folks, to get folks to focus on this risk. The next time may not be so easy. And so the psychological risk is both interesting but also concerning. The last two that I want to talk about are ones that are well known to all of us in various and different ways. The first is what essentially boils down to mis and disinformation. Something that we all experienced in varying and different ways, no matter where you are on the spectrum of beliefs about COVID. We all experienced mis and disinformation. And I want to be clear here, because I expressly am not making, again, a political point. There was misinformation that emanated from various and different right-wing circles. And that, in my view, accounted for the bulk of the mis and disinformation, make no mistake. But there was also misinformation, hyperventilation, exaggeration that came from the other side as well. And so you might think, again, that I'm making a political point about how mis and disinformation are impossible to overcome. Because the truth of the matter is when I get into rooms to talk with experts from around the country, around the globe about how to prepare for the next pandemic, one of the things you hear a lot in those rooms is, oh, we can't do anything about mis and disinformation. And it is what it is. It's a phrase I hear all the time. I hate that phrase. Because the fact of the matter is, it's not what it is. Mis and disinformation are not something we need to resign ourselves to just having to deal with. And how do I know that? Because we dealt with it here in Maine. By the end of the first wave of boosters in roughly November of 2021, take a guess as to what state in the country was the most vaccinated state. Yes, the state of Maine, by several percentage points above Hawaii and Vermont. We were at about 84% vaccinated after the first wave of boosters. Hawaii was about 81 and Vermont about 77 and a half. Not that I'm counting or anything, but if you had asked me at the beginning of the pandemic how I would have fared, how I thought we would have fared as part of our vaccination effort, there's no way I would have guessed the number would have been that high. I would have suspected that mis and disinformation would have gained hold, and no way I would have thought we would have achieved those figures. Indeed, most pundits didn't think we could achieve those figures. But we overcame the scourges of mis and disinformation, again, on the left and on the right. And we did it through thoughtful, deliberate anticipation of what was coming. Before mis and disinformation could gain hold, we were already on top of it. We had already said, you're going to hear that in a couple days. You're going to see that on Facebook in about 72 hours. Don't believe it. And there's an old lie, or there's an old line first attributed to Mark Twain, but it is not actually even really from him, which is that that a lie can spread around the globe by the time that the truth hasn't even gotten its shoes on. And that's true for the most part. And again, that leads people to be resigned to the fact that mis and disinformation can't be overcome. But I'm really proud of the way that here in Maine, we looked ahead, we looked around the corner to see what was coming, and then we got ahead of it. And we said to people, you're going to hear this lie that said that the Trump administration cut corners on that vaccine and that it's dangerous. And we said, you shouldn't believe that lie. And we would hear later, you're going to hear a lie from Republicans in Congress that the vaccine has a microchip in it. You shouldn't believe that either. But we were the ones on top of that and anticipating it, a technique called pre-bunking, before it was able to gain a foothold. And I firmly believe, above all other reasons, the reason why Maine's vaccination rate was so high was in part because we didn't let mis and disinformation take hold here. So that credit to all of us as a state. But that is frankly the easy stuff when it comes to mis and disinformation. That's stuff anybody can do. The real threat of mis and disinformation with respect to the next pandemic, frankly, is far darker and far more insidious. And that is the role already, but certainly more in the future, of AI-based tools to generate and spread this content faster than anyone can even imagine. It used to be if you were a nefarious government and you wanted to sow discord and doubt in the United States, you'd have to hire 1,000, 10,000 guys on a computer somewhere and have them be hacking away at fake Twitter accounts, coming up with stuff. And I'm not really exaggerating at all. One of our adversaries has done for years just that. Armies, literal armies of people who are proficient in English, generating and amplifying mis and disinformation. It's time intensive, it's expensive, it entails security leaks of its own. But nowadays, with AI tools as the way they are currently based, you can do all of that with a smart computer scientist and a laptop in an afternoon. And it's becoming even more powerful. Now, I am not averse to these tools. I use them all the time. This is not a broadside against AI. But it is a risk that we need to be cognizant of, and that all of us as consumers of information, as users of Facebook and other social media platforms, need to be aware as a specter. The social media companies have pretty well said they're not going to do anything about it. Let 1,000 flowers bloom, however odious those flowers may be. And so it's going to be on us to, one, stay on top of mis and disinformation, and number two, keep our skeptical antenna high anytime you see something on social media. As Abraham Lincoln said, as I read on Facebook a couple weeks ago, Abraham Lincoln was famous for saying, "Don't believe everything you read on the internet." And so we ourselves are going to have to do our part to make sure we're keeping our skepticism high. And the last threat that leaves us vulnerable, unprepared for the next pandemic, is the T word, and that's trust. You can't talk about public health nowadays without talking about trust. And so where are we with respect to trust in public health institutions in the current moment? Again, looking forward, not so much looking backward. And the picture is decidedly mixed. Secretary Kennedy, in my view, forget about my view. What the data show is that there are a contingent of Americans who will place more faith in the CDC's judgments because of Secretary Kennedy. Based on a poll from May, so a couple months now, 2 months ago, about 28% of Americans polled said they will believe in the advice of the CDC more because of Secretary Kennedy. That is outweighed by the percentage of Americans who believe they will trust the CDC less. So it's a mixed bag. 44% of respondents said that as a result of the Secretary's efforts, 44% say they will trust the CDC's guidance and advice less. 28% say they will trust it more. So net of net, trust in our public health institutions is down in recent weeks, recent months. These things are very malleable. They can change almost on an instant. So I'm hesitant to make broadside predictions as to how trust will shake out over the next weeks, months, and years. But make no mistake, when it comes to navigating a disaster, a crisis, a pandemic, a flood, a terrible public safety event, what matters for getting through that disaster, to say nothing of rebounding and having resilience after, what matters more than anything is not your preparedness. It's not how much money you've got. It's not how much funding you've got. It's not how much PPE you had, although all of those things are important. What matters more than anything in predicting how a community will come through a crisis is the leadership that's in place. That is by far, over and over, no matter what part of the world you look at, the single best predictor for how a community, a society will fare. And leadership in times of crisis is frankly not magic. Leadership in the time of crisis basically comes down to knowing the right things to do and then having the trust of people to make sure that you're communicating those right things to them. So it's imminently doable. But the question for us here in Maine, then, is if leadership is what matters, what steps can we take right now in our state to prepare ourselves for the next pandemic? As the Secretary and President Trump have already noted, the federal government is not going to come to our aid. They have made statements to that effect vis-a-vis FEMA, although they have pulled back in recent days. But they've made it very clear that their model of governance is going to be states first, federalism to the extreme. So what can we here in Maine do to foster trust, to build preparedness, to engender resilience, to be ready for the next threat, whether it's a pandemic, a flood, a crisis of any sort? There are a few things. The first is one I've already touched on, which is investing in local health infrastructure, as you all have already done. There are boxes of free COVID tests available in the lobby of the health clinic. If you don't have one, please stop by and get one, because all of those early warning signals only work if everyone's ready to go at the most local of levels. So investing in health centers at the local level, making sure they've got rapid tests available so that if someone is sick, quick action can be taken to contain it before it spreads to vital infrastructure across the island. These very local actions of preparedness are more important than ever. And that's why I was so taken by the steps that you all have made here on the island to be ready for the next disaster. So getting ready and investing in your health and preparedness infrastructure at the local level is of outsized importance right now, given the signals we've been getting from DC. The second thing that all of us can do is advocate to our local and elected officials. I am not, again, taking a political position. What you advocate for is up to you. My ask, my exhortation this evening is that you advocate for something. Maybe it's pandemic preparedness, maybe it's flood resilience dollars, maybe it's for general all hazards preparedness, whatever the case may be. Now is the time to advocate. It's more important than ever, not just to our local elected officials in Augusta, but to our congressional delegation, as well as to the governor's office. Folks need to know that preparedness is a priority for every single community in Maine. And the only way we do that is through collective advocacy. And the third thing that we can do, and part of the reason why I wanted to join you this evening, is that we can tell our stories. I put a very deliberate emphasis there on the word story, because all too often in science, medicine, public health, what have you, we tend to put over-reliance on numbers and data and under-reliance on narratives and stories. Very few rooms or meetings that I've been in asking for funding, advocating for a position. Very few of those meetings with a skeptic on the other side of the table. In virtually no instance that I can think of, was it numbers and data that carried the day. It was almost always a story. Because for folks that don't believe in your numbers, who don't believe in your data, it's easy to discount it. Oh, you're biased. I don't know who collected those. You use weird metrics. You cook the books. It's very easy to discount numbers and data. But it's very difficult to dismiss a story. And so when it comes time to talking about the next pandemic and advocating for our need to be collectively prepared, literally at every level, from Islesboro to DC to Geneva to Hong Kong, it's stories that matter. And so as I've gone around the country to talk about the need for more funding, in my prior role at the CDC was my job, I've made sure to put stories front and center. And so the story that I will end with is one I'm incredibly proud of. I already have referenced it. I let the cat out of the bag a little bit already. But about a year and a half ago, I had the privilege and the honor of briefing one of the highest offices in the United States. Not the big boss, but the guy that reports directly to the guy. And I had the privilege and the honor of briefing him on avian influenza preparedness, bird flu, something that I think is likely to be at least a candidate for the next pandemic. And I was talking with him about mis and disinformation, and I've already hinted at this. And he said, as many folks do, oh, there's nothing we can do about that. We can make the vaccine if we want to. I was advocating that we start preparing a vaccine, which we did. And he said, yeah, you can prepare the vaccine, but no one's going to take it. Misinformation is going to fall into place, and no one's going to take your damn vaccine, Shah. And I said, all due respect, sir, I disagree. And he said, oh, yeah, you disagree? What you got? And I said, well, I can name at least one state where mis and disinformation were threats, but through thoughtful, deliberate, anticipatory communication, we overcame those threats and ended up with a vaccination rate that, if this state were its own country, would be the top 5 most vaccinated countries in the world, up there with Qatar and Andalusia, Andorra and Gibraltar, and a couple of other places in the world would rank as one of the most vaccinated places in the world. And it's proof positive that we should move forward with all this preparedness, anticipating mis and disinformation, not just discounting it. And he said, "Oh yeah, really? Well, what state is that?" And I said, "Sir, that's the state of Maine." And so all of this is possible, even if we can't buffer ourselves against the ecological risk that I mentioned, the crowding and the convergence. These other pieces are very much in our control. But what we all need to do now is make sure we're investing not just in our infrastructure, but finding leaders who will help us navigate these risks, because the next pandemic, the next flood, the next crisis is coming our way. Now is the time to think about that and make sure our financial house is in order and that our leaders are ready to get us where we need to go. So with that, thank you all so much for the invitation. I very much appreciate it. Thank you all so much. I look forward to your questions. Thank you. I already see some hands. Now, I got to do one thing, because right before I went on, not only did Bruce offer me a Diet Coke, but a gentleman came up to me with a wrapped package that is cold. And I can only assume it is a Diet Coke. I don't see that gentleman directly in front of me. There he is. Yes, sir. So a Coke Zero. Wait a minute now. What is this, Europe? Well, Coke Zero. Holy cow. Okay, all right, well. All right, well, I am thankful, and I will enjoy it after the Diet Coke, however. So thank you, sir. I didn't get to thank you for it earlier. So, all right, yes, ma'am. We're gonna go to the first question. We're gonna start right over here.
Dr. Shah, my whole days revolved around when your press conference was on Facebook and broadcast. And you were so comforting and so humble, and you just gave everybody faith that we were going to be okay. So for that, I want to thank you. You talk about stories. We were so excited when we could finally go to Bangor and get a vaccine. From the time we got a vaccine, members of our family decided we were shedding spike proteins, and it's been 5 years since we had a hug.
Yeah, that's a story. Well, first, what was your name, ma'am? Diane. First, thank you for saying that. It was the privilege of a lifetime to be able to be at least the spokesperson for a lot of the work that was happening across the state. I wasn't doing all of that work, but I heard their stories, and it was a privilege to be able to talk about those stories and contextualize them in a time of crisis. When Dory and Owen and I were talking earlier, they were sharing with me the way in which they would take what I talked about and then apply it and actualize it here on the ground. That's impressive and meaningful to me, because it demonstrates how, one, Maine really truly is a community unlike any other. But it's also the best practice for navigating a crisis, because the actual work of getting folks through on a day-to-day basis happens community by community. It doesn't happen in Augusta. It certainly doesn't happen in DC. And so I was deeply impressed with the way that you all collectively led your own community. That's how it should be, and that's why I think you saw buy-in rates, vaccination rates in Islesboro that, if Maine was one of the most vaccinated countries, if we were a country, Islesboro would be at the capital of that list. So kudos to you all. Now, to your other point, stories go both ways, because they can be useful, but folks who disagree with us on things have their own stories. That is one reason I actually place outsized importance on stories. All too often, folks of my stripe rely on data to think that data will overcome skepticism and opposition. but I suspect that you could sit down with Nobel Prize winning scientists with your family members, and they would not just be, it's not only that they wouldn't be convinced, they would walk out of that meeting with even harder beliefs about the rightness of their position. And that's because of a psychological error that we make sometimes. And I think we've all had this experience. The error is that we sometimes think that people who disagree with us disagree because they just don't know as much as we do, right? We think that the model is that there's an educational deficit. And if only we could educate them in the way that we have been educated, they would immediately see the world in the way that we do. But human psychology we all know this. It doesn't work that way. How many times have you been in a dinner party with some obnoxious SOB who just won't leave you alone and just is trying to convince you of how right their view is on whatever it is you're talking about? It doesn't work. No human mind has ever been convinced in history of the rightness of someone else's position by debating and haranguing. It doesn't work that way. What does work are stories. And so it's troublesome sometimes when folks have their own versions of the stories. But if we want to have any hope of arriving or understanding what others are thinking, it's not going to be through data, it's going to be through stories, even though sometimes those can be quite challenging. So.
Who helped us a great deal, who's not here but needs to be recognized, is Roger Hyman.
I heard.
He was every single day passing out information he was getting from the health center and communicating.
Indeed. And Dory and Owen and Linda and Bruce and Carrie spoke of his, sang his praises today. I wish he were here so that I could thank him in person. So I'll have to come back when he's here. I'm going to go to this side of the room. We're going to bounce back and forth. So, yes, sir.
My name is Doug, and I have a question about the near future, not the past. With the turmoil that's going on at the CDC in Washington, and especially what we've been reading about evaluating vaccines, for instance, the flu shot in the fall, do we know that we've got the right version of the shot, and also the next COVID? Because usually, lately, the fall has been when the COVID vaccine has been updated. Those of us in my age group are pretty concerned about it.
Yes, indeed. Good. Great question, sir. Thank you for raising it. I'll take them in kind. Let's start with the COVID shot. The decision was made by the FDA and the CDC very shortly after my departure around the formulation for this year's COVID vaccine. And they decided to keep it the same as last year's. I think that's the correct call. I think scientifically that is correct. The virus has changed, but not so much so, such that using the same vaccine as last year makes a lot of sense to me. Similarly with the flu vaccine, the components of the flu vaccine are chosen largely at an international level by the WHO. Now the CDC, if I may say, is basically the big dog that drives that discussion. Our chief influenza scientist, her name is Dr. Vivian Dugan. She represents the United States at that meeting. I usually go, and we have the most data. We have all the data and the science. So even there, the flu vaccine composition that we will all get in the fall was chosen scientifically accurately. A couple months ago, I would have said that these explicitly scientific decisions are probably not going to be affected by political intrusion. I am not as confident in that anymore. So check back with me in a year, and we'll see how things are faring. So, yes, sir. We're going to go. Yes, sir. Well, gentlemen, we'll go to you, and then, whichever. I'll let you guys duke it out. Whoever wants to go.
So I always screw up the names of books, but I think the book was Station 11 that came out.
Oh, wonderful book.
15 years ago. It was Georgian flu. It was pandemic.
Yes.
It far exceeded the impact of COVID. And a huge, huge population loss. And so if you supposes that is the potential risk, that's what we have to be concerned about. How much money really would be required to design a public health system that will allow us to respond?
Great. Just to put a plug in for Station 11, a wonderful post-apocalyptic fiction book by an author named Emily St. John Mandel, who I have a major intellectual crush on. Her other book, Sea of Tranquility, is this brilliant discussion of metaphysics, et cetera. We should invite her. next year. I mean, because I will absolutely come to listen to her speak. By the by, I know you said you don't like to drop names of books, but I try not to either. But there's another book that I read a couple weeks ago called Severance by a woman who's an author in Chicago named Ling Ma. That's kind of the same idea. It was not nearly as good, but it was an interesting side-by-side comparison. Leaving all of that aside, how much money would it take for us to plan for a situation like that? Innumerable, hundreds of trillions of dollars. And so it's almost to the point of impracticability. So two observations there. The first is, it's a reasonable question to ask, what is the goal of our pandemic preparedness system? Or to put it differently, what kinds of threats are we actually planning and preparing for? Because the truth of the matter is, our systems are not really well designed to deal with world-ending pandemics. Maybe they should be, and we can have that debate, but our systems are largely designed to deal with the thesis that I mentioned, something that starts small, grows through neglect, and then exposes our weaknesses. Over the past couple of years at CDC and across the federal government, I led a rather aggressive effort to rethink our preparedness posture. Much of the posture that we at CDC had for years was the post-9/11 mindset, where biological threats were thought of as largely the byproduct of bioterrorism, anthrax. And so much of our architecture, I talked about how would we know, things like that. Much of our architecture was engineered around smaller conflagrations of man-made or bioterrorism-related threats. We weren't really thinking big in terms of pandemics. We had plans for influenza, but we didn't really have major plans for a lot of other diseases. And so a large effort that I undertook across the US government was to get us ready for those. It's still an ongoing piece of work, but and one that I'm concerned about given the current leadership. So, but that answers your question of the scale of what we're dealing with. Sir, I'm gonna come back to you, but we're gonna go this side of the room next. Yes, I will. Good call, by all means. Yes.
So what did we learn because what we tried with COVID that would adjust health practices for the next pandemic?
Outstanding question. The question is, what did we learn during COVID that would impact our response for the next pandemic? It's an outstanding question. I'm going to answer it in two ways. One is I can tell you what we learned in Maine, because that will be directly relevant for all of us. In Maine, we learned a couple of really key things. The first is the importance of frequent public communication. And that, I think, as Diane mentioned a moment ago, is critical. That was not the game plan to begin with, but it was something I felt very, very strongly about, given an experience that I had in Illinois with Legionnaire's disease, where I didn't do a good job on that, and I wanted to rectify that. I learned from that. The other thing that we learned here that will absolutely impact our preparedness and response is the significance of day-to-day challenges that face everyday Mainers. Transportation, for example. I made a deliberate judgment call during COVID in our vaccine structure to prioritize large vaccination centers, Bangor, things like that. But the downside of that was that people had to drive, which was hard to do in January. It was expensive, so on and so forth. The next time around, I wouldn't change that approach, because it's one reason we rocketed to the tops of the vaccination charts so quickly, because we were churning out at one point 25,000 shots a day. But making sure that transportation was key would be another piece of that. And the third would be the importance of social services. It's all well and good to tell somebody to isolate or to quarantine, but where are they going to eat? What are they going to eat? Who's going to get them food? Those things we eventually got around to addressing, but I have a far keener sense of the importance, the social implications of words like quarantine and isolation. Those are some of the key lessons from Maine. What did we learn nationally that will impact our performance in the next pandemic? I'm honestly not being dramatic. I can't think of anything. I can't point to a single structural change that has been made. I can point to a couple of programmatic changes. So, for example, and this stuff gets wonky. I don't want to drone on too long, but one of the things that I'm really proud of that we undertook at CDC was a far more streamlined effort to get tests out. The failures of the CDC in the early days of the pandemic are legion and well documented, specifically around diagnostic testing. Many of the problems, the root causes for why the CDC screwed up so badly have very much been remedied, many of which under my directive. So things like diagnostic speed, things of that nature, we are in a far better position for. And you saw that in the Mpox outbreak, and you also see it right now with avian influenza. Those are programmatic. They are not structural per se. So yet another reason why I am concerned that we are not fully ready is, again, going back to my thesis, not only do these things start off small, grow from neglect, expose the rot, but we don't address those structural inequities because we are searching for quick answers in the time of a crisis. So one of these questions I'm going to have some good news on. I just don't know what it is yet. I'm going to go to the gentleman there, and then, ma'am, we're going to come back to you at the next round. Yes, sir.
Engineered gain of function lab leak or pangolin in an animal wetland?
I am not an expert on this, to be clear, but all the briefings I had by folks who are lifetime career virologists at CDC, NIH, Scripps, the Broad Institute, friends of mine I've talked to who are dyed-in-the-wool virologists, I've probably had 30 or 40 briefings on this because it's a question I get a lot from members of Congress and such. Not one of these folks, including a woman who was nominated for a Nobel Prize, and I mean, these are the folks I've chatted with, and not a single one of them believes that it was an engineered virus. So leaving that hypothesis aside, 90% of them believe, 95% of them believe that it was a naturally evolved virus that spilled over, as I indicated earlier, from some animal, probably a pangolin, that then gave it to one of the animals in the wet market, that then gave it to a human. That appears to be the consensus view of about 95 to 98% of scientists I've talked to. I have talked to one or two who I consider to be highly credible, people that really do this work and thus actually can engage with it. One or two that suggest that we should leave open the possibility that it was a lab leak, but not insidiously or deliberately so. But their view is not that it was, but rather we should remain open to that analysis. Frankly, and I'm going to say something slightly impolitic here, but the only folks who I've interacted with who strongly believe it was a engineered bioweapon are folks that when you ask them about their research credibility, their bona fides, they don't have it. So I'm deeply skeptical of their analysis. I tend to trust the ones who, this is what they do. They are coronavirus scientists, and they know this stuff backwards and forwards. I am not an expert. I don't have primary knowledge on those things, but that's based on the reliance I've had of people that really do. I want to make another really just brief point, though, that's important to this broader dialogue of trust. If you'll permit me an extra minute. About a month or two into the vaccination effort, I was in Bangor at the Cross Insurance Center where they were having one of their mega clinics. And a guy came up to me. He had brought his family there, but he himself didn't want to get vaccinated. And he came up to me and he said, "Hey, you're that guy on TV." And I said, "Well, I'm a guy on TV. I mean, I'm not the guy." And he said, "Yeah, you're always talking about that vaccine." He said, "Yeah, I mean, I don't want that vaccine." I said, "It's fine, sir. Yeah, great, understood." He said, "But how do you know it works?" And I actually had to admit, how did I know it worked? I mean, I'm not a vaccine researcher. I'm not a virologist. I am not a clinical researcher. I was not involved in any of the clinical trials that studied the safety, the effectiveness of the vaccine. I am not an mRNA researcher. I'm not a vaccinologist. I'm not an immunologist. I'm not any of those things. And yet here I was talking about how great the vaccine was. How did I know that? And so his question really, really was an important one. And when I came to realize, it gets back to Diane's question about how people believe things that they do. What I came to realize, and I've taken this with me not just in public health, but in other aspects of the world, I believe that the vaccines work. I know that the vaccines work because I am part of a chain of trust of people that know the vaccines work. I went to the schools and trained with the people, and I'm friends with the people who are vaccinologists and who are researchers and who were involved in the design and testing of the vaccine. And I know them from school, and I know the books they read, because we all read Station 11, and I know where they go, and I know the schools they went to, and I know what those credentials mean, and I know what the journals they publish in represent. And so I'm part of this chain of trust, such that when one of them says, hey, Nirav, this vaccine works, I know what they know, and so I say, cool, sounds good to me. Send me the article, and I read the article, and I say, yeah, all right, sounds good to me. And that's how I know the vaccine works. But Diane's family, they're part of a completely separate chain of trust. One with a radically different way of assimilating information with others who are totems of information in their community. And so they know that the spike protein is dangerous through a completely separate chain of trust. One that I have no standing in, let alone any understanding of. And so when I think about communication in the moment of a crisis, whether again it's a flood, a shooting, or a pandemic, the way that I approach these things is through this notion of how do the different audiences I have, what are their chains of trust? And how can I speak? What sources of import can I use, of authority, that will resonate with folks who are part of a completely separate chain of trust? And that's how, after that experience in Bangor in January, February 2021, I radically changed the way I talked about the vaccines, completely. I really, really ruminated on this. I stopped talking about the vaccines as safe. I don't know what safe is. Safe to you is different from safe to me. I talked about them as our best defense, right? I didn't talk about how the New England Journal had a paper. Who cares about the New England Journal of Medicine? I talked about, and so I radically changed that. And again, I believe that's one reason why I was even able to get skeptics on board. If you'll permit me just one more moment of reflection, I don't do this too often, but it's been on my mind. The proudest moment I had during the pandemic was I approached the folks who run Maine Calling, Jennifer Rooks and Cindy Hahn, and I said, I got a crazy idea for you. I want to do a whole hour of Maine Calling that's just vaccine skeptics. I don't want anyone who's calling in who already got the vaccine or is going to get the vaccine. I don't want to hear from them. I got them already. I want to hear from the skeptics. And so my comms director said, are you crazy? I said, I'm going to do it. The governor said, if you fall on your face, Shah, that's on you. I said, yes, ma'am, I'm going to do it. So we get on the air. About halfway through, this guy calls in, Wes from Gorham. And he calls in, he said, hey, Dr. Shah, I heard all that nonsense you talk about, but I'm just really worried about these side effects, really worried about these side effects. I don't know if I want to get that vaccine, these side effects, I've heard I could become infertile. I'm really worried about this. And I said, Wes, I hear what you're talking about, but let me talk you through it. You're going to have side effects. You're going to have a sore arm. You're going to be crummy for a couple days. Get the shot on a Friday. Don't get it on a Monday. And as far as your other concerns, there's no evidence of that. Most of the concerns that people have, they come and go within a matter of days, and I walked them through it. And at the end of that, he said, live on air in front of 1.4 million Mainers, he said, Dr. Shah, I think I'm going to get that vaccine. And I should have resigned that day. I'm done. But the point being, there's these diversity of views. There are a lot of folks that believe COVID emerged from a laboratory. Great, let's hear it out. I treat those views with respect. I make my own decisions ultimately, but I don't denigrate, I don't talk down, I don't condescend. And that's why I think to this day, Maine remains largely apolitical on these matters. So, sorry, I answered your question in 27 different ways than you intended, but it's been on my mind a lot. We're going to come back to this side of the room, and then the woman in blue goes next. Carrie.
So when you were talking about preparedness for the next pandemic, one of the big media headlines that was so scary and out there all the time was that our national stockpiles of critical things that we needed to fight the pandemic, things like ventilators, PPE, and things like that, were woefully short. We didn't have enough, and everybody was scrambling. All the governors had to do it themselves eventually. So where do we stand on that now? Do we have good stockpiles? Are they the correct things?
Good, great. Sorry, Gail, I have not been repeating the question, so I'm going to do so. So Carrie asks whether our national stockpile of stuff is appropriate and adequate for the next pandemic. The answer is largely yes on some things, no on most things. And I'm not going to go through the laundry list, but it goes back to a deeper question that the gentleman asked earlier, which is, who asked about Station 11. What would it take to be truly prepared for a life-altering pandemic? And again, the answer is in the hundreds of trillions of dollars. And so on some extent, I give the federal government a modestly passing grade for not having sufficient supplies of everything. Because to have sufficient supplies of everything and to keep them up to date and unexpired, et cetera, would be almost too expensive as to render it useful, or as to render it unuseful. And I understand that trade-off. I understand that dilemma that planners face. It's not an easy one to rectify. So then I think the question is, what do we need to have in the stockpile that's a can't miss, right? Maybe it's okay if the ventilators take us a couple of weeks to spin up. But what do we need to have in the stockpile for day one responsiveness? And there I think we fare a little bit better. So for example, the bug that's likely, possibly responsible for the next pandemic, I've already mentioned. It's influenza, avian influenza, et cetera. And for that, there are medications that are effective. We can argue about how effective, but they do exist. Tamiflu is the one that folks maybe have taken if you got the regular flu. And there are very robust supplies in the SNS, enough Tamiflu to go around basically for the entire country. There are not some of the more modern ones that I've urged us to have, but on some of those day one mitigation measures, response measures, we do have strong supplies of them. And they last forever. There are other areas where I have deeper concerns though, because flu is one thing, but what about all the other bugs out there? So, yep. Yes, ma'am, in the blue.
So I was working in healthcare when COVID hit. It was extremely stressful. I was in a laboratory. It was extremely stressful because things were changing all the time. But, we'd start over from scratch a week after we just put something new in place. And I was working with nurses as well. During that time period, I became so stressed out that I eventually retired early because I was a basket case. Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of other medical people, laboratory people, nursing staff, and these were the experienced people.
Yeah.
So I think that is another weakness in our plan.
What's your name, ma'am? Michelle. So I have a longer version of these remarks, but I wanted to keep it short for the evening. So one of the threats that I omitted from my laundry list is what I call educational threats. And it's just what you said, Michelle, which is workforce. The public health and the healthcare workforce in Maine in particular, the red emergency lights are flashing on the dashboard. And I think we've all seen it. I was talking again with Owen and Darcy about the challenges of getting staff at the health center here. And those are replicating themselves across the state of Maine. To add to the fact that Medicaid is being cut back, hospitals were already in jeopardy, nursing homes are already facing a tough spot. From a healthcare and public health perspective, I am not exaggerating when I say we are quickly approaching a crisis. And again, as you think about leadership, this is what should be on everybody's mind. You are absolutely correct that burnout, and just being fed up with the field have precipitated a significant departure from healthcare, particularly in Maine. The difficulty there is manifold. One is that many of those workers were the most experienced, the most seasoned, such as yourself. I'm guessing you had decades under your belt. That's the category of folks that are saying, I'm out. That leaves us even less prepared. The places where that is happening are partly in Portland and Bangor and Lewiston, but it's more pronounced in rural areas, which adds to the stress and the strain of already stressed hospitals, which then means those hospitals have to pare back on services and sometimes close lines of services, which means less people want to move there if they can't even get health care. So when I say that this problem cannot be over-exaggerated, I am not over-exaggerating. It is quickly reaching a crisis. Now, I'm thinking about it in this current moment from a pandemic perspective. Are we ready from a health workforce perspective when the next pandemic hits? No. But forget about pandemics for a second, if you can. Because the problem is just as acute for day-to-day Mainers right now, let alone as you think about the next pandemic. So I am not exaggerating when I say that healthcare and public health in Maine are at a crisis. And we need to treat it like a crisis. We don't need to be thinking about policy solutions and kind of navel gaze for years and years. We need to treat it like a crisis and have a crisis management approach to it rather than just purely a policy-based approach. Yes, sir. We're gonna bounce back and forth. Yes, sir. Yes.
Obviously, you can't control where birds fly.
Yeah, exactly.
Our daughter happens to be in that field, all right? So the question I have is the CDC doing anything specific about preventing the development of it? You can't control the transmission.
Yeah. Yes, good. The gentleman's question is specifically on avian flu, which I've referenced a couple of times. And the specific question is the CDC doing anything particular to combat the risk of avian flu? Gentleman recognizes that we don't control flight patterns and migratory patterns of birds, which is the principal mechanism through which avian flu spreads. That's tough to control. And that has been how it's emerged from Hong Kong all the way to Newfoundland and everywhere in between. What the area of focus of the CDC is, and this is a portfolio that I was deeply involved with, was really preventing the human spillover. We have had a number of cases in the United States since March of 2024 because of some crazy, almost science fiction-y things that happened. And as a result, we did have a bunch of human cases, mainly in dairy farm workers who live in close quarters with one another. They're often undocumented or migrants who are shy or gun-shy about hanging out with doctors or the healthcare system. And so our area of focus at the CDC was to limit the extent to which dairy workers were exposed, getting them PPE, things of that nature, and then coupling that with rapid diagnostics and Tamiflu, so that if a dairy worker in the middle of Texas started having runny nose and a cough, they were immediately given Tamiflu, like that day. We haven't had a case in 5 months now. The last human case was in February. Are we out of the woods on avian flu? Not even close, because it has a very strong seasonal component. And so it's just a matter of time before migratory patterns change and there's more human cases. The one thing that's keeping me up at night from a pandemic perspective is avian flu. So, Gail, can I take one more question? Last question. Yes, ma'am, right down here. Jane. Jan.
So close.
Electronics, personal. Are you accurate to say that the pangolin is responsible?
The pangolin is part of the chain of transmission that led to coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, coming into humans. Whether it was the most immediate predecessor or whether it was one of the intermediate ones, no one's 100% sure. But it was part of that chain. The genetics have revealed and it's been recovered from wild pangolin. So it's been incubating in the pangolin population for a long time. What's a pangolin? Yeah, exactly. I'm about to get the vaudevillian cane to get off, so I'm not going to go into my pangolin talk. But
Weird creature?
yeah. I mean, it is out of a science fiction novel. They are wild things, and they tend to harbor a lot of different viruses. So they are somewhere in the chain of this spillover, whether it is the thing that caused it to go to humans or whether the pangolin gave it to something else that then was in this wild market in Wuhan. It might be known, I am not as up on that, so I don't want to give you wrong information, but I know it's in the chain, and so it's been pointed at as a culprit, but whether it's the prime culprit or just an accomplice, we don't quite know. Oh, they're cute as hell. They're great animals. I mean, I got no beef with pangolins other than stop spreading viruses to us. So, Bill Hook. Okay, thank you all so much. Really, really appreciate it. Very much appreciate it. That was mine. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you all. A real honor. A real honor. Thank you so much. Thank you. I can't wait to be back. So, thank you all. Thank you, Gail. You're very welcome. You're very, very welcome.